I think what 5 to 4 has given to a lot of people is the sense that, like, hey, it's not just you. Like, you're not alone in thinking this way. You're not wrong. The law is wrong.
I feel like when I was reading the book, you sort of make the case, not just that Jones Day sort of advised and hitched their wagon to Trump, but in some ways made Trump.
In the conservative movement, they've done a really, really good job of building a network, building a community, and kind of staying connected and cultivating those ties to such an extent that a Supreme Court justice thinks it's appropriate to go party with the people who are arguing at that moment before their court.
You know, big law is a pretty clear trade. Your time and your morals, and then money in exchange. And Jones Day doesn't even guarantee the money.
Yeah.
Everyone I talk to about this book is like, but wait, everyone deserves legal representation. You're attacking these poor lawyers for just doing their jobs and zealously representing clients.
Versus somebody who has been marginalized and largely failed by every system that is supposed to support them throughout life.
Come on, you went out and sought that client. You did everything in your power to make yourself and your legal strategies not just attractive to those clients, but known to those clients. See, I'm still like from the outsider point of view where I'm like, I'm at Harvard Law. It's like very exciting and awing to me. You guys.
No, it's cursed, David.
Yeah, I'm getting that sense. That was news to me.
And if you're attending this, you are in the bottom of the class.
You know,
the kids in the top 5% are interviewing for Supreme Court clerkships right now.
That is an argument in bad faith. Nobody goes to Jones Day saying, "Mommy, Johnson & Johnson doesn't have a lawyer." You know what I mean? Like that's not a real fucking thing.
They are hiring at places like this school 70% of graduates.
Wherever the line has been set in the law, it is way too far out there. And we need to be far more aggressive in general about making people feel like shit if they're going to do shitty things.
And I didn't even know like a community like this existed at Harvard or anywhere else. So this has been a kind of refreshing, very interesting.
You mean like a community of sort of good people? Is that what you're saying?
Those are your words, not mine, Rhi.
Legal education as we know it, and the legal profession as we know it, began here.
Hey, I'm coming up. I'll take this seat. So a little peek behind the curtain. I was supposed to do this with my friend in college, Josie Duffy Rice, who can't be here for COVID-adjacent reasons, which is tough. So that does mean, though, that this is taking on sort of an uncanny resemblance to like Nightmare, like the nerdiest imaginable groomsman wedding toast. So for the next 45 minutes, I will be your tour guide on Peter, Rhiannon, and Michael's journey through love. No, my first interaction with our buds here at 5 to 4 came early in the pandemic, a few weeks, a few months in. Honestly, it was kind of a blur. When the same thing happened to me that I assume happened to all of you, I ran out of podcasts to listen to. Thank you. There weren't any sports going on. Wasn't a whole lot going on at the time. I'd cleared out my queue of the Ben Shapiro Show. And I had listened to every episode of Strict Scrutiny twice. Once just for fun, and obviously once to take notes. So I go into my app, and the show comes up, things you might like, recommended, whatever. I figure, sure, why not? And it was honestly a little uncanny to hear in my earbuds as I'm like cleaning the bathroom or whatever, people talk about the Supreme Court and the law more generally. Not the way professors do, not the way pundits do, not the way lawyers do, but the way real people do. Like, yeah, of course this is a political project. Of course this is an ideological project. Why wouldn't it be? It would be weird if it weren't. And at the time, I'd been lucky enough to work at places that gave me like a pretty long leash in terms of how I wrote about and talked about the court. But that's like generally the exception rather than the rule in legal media. Like, it's also been my experience that if you're writing at bigger, sort of more establishment outlets, and you say something like, judges are politicians or whatever, you'll get a note from your editor that's like, hey, it's really not appropriate for you to say that. We got to figure out something else. And you have to have that fight with them then, and typically, as a writer, you lose that. I'm not gonna, I don't think it's appropriate to name names or outlets of who I had to have that fight with. What's the ocean nearest to us? Yeah, okay. But I think the reason 5 to 4 has been successful and resonant, apart from their talents and the work they put into it, is that they've tapped into sort of this broader sentiment on the legal left, especially among younger lawyers, especially among law students, that the people and institutions who they counted on to teach them, to equip them, to do some good in the world, had largely failed them. And at the risk of being sincere up here, it's been really nice for, I think, every law student who's read an opinion, heard something in class, heard something during lecture, and thought, that's the most fucked up thing I've ever heard. But then they just kind of have to write it in their notebook anyway. And I think what 5 to 4 has given to a lot of people is the sense that, hey, it's not just you. You're not alone in thinking this way. You're not wrong, the law is wrong. And I think giving people that perspective and that confidence is going to give sort of a next generation of lawyers the chance to do something about it. So I'm grateful for their work. I'm grateful for the energy and the sense of humor that they bring to this. I'm glad to have been able to collaborate with them on some stuff over the years. And as the show has gotten more successful and more influential going forward, I'm really glad that the hosts have more time and energy to dedicate to this project themselves. As I understand it, some of the hosts have more time voluntarily. Others, it wasn't super their choice. Anyway, please, hands together, please welcome Peter, Rhiannon, and Michael of 5-4.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Jay. That was really lovely. Before we start, I just wanted to say something really quick. Might change the tone a little bit in here today, but Tyree Nichols, a photographer and a skateboarder who lived in Memphis, was beaten to death by Memphis police officers a couple of weeks ago. Many in the room, I'm sure, have heard about this maybe just in the past 24 hours because body cam footage was released yesterday. I wanted to say his name and honor Mr. Nichols' life and the loss of his life, even though it isn't what we're talking about here. And maybe just point out, to connect it to the conference this weekend, that corporate capture of the legal system, in addition to everything that's been discussed over the course of this conference, it also contributes to turning a blind eye in many legal spaces that relate to the public, that relate to our rights, that relate to the people, right? Corporate capture of the legal system contributes to the perpetuation, the permission given, the institutional upholding of police brutality. People die as a result. So rest in peace, Tyree Nichols. Sorry, guys. Okay, let's have fun.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. It's my job to transition out of that. Thanks for coming to the recording. We are honored to be here. These are hallowed halls, of course. Alum like Henry Kissinger, Ted Kaczynski, Neil Gorsuch, right? Famous donors like Jeffrey Epstein. Truly a magical institution. Sorry, Jay Willis. We're first of all, Jay, thank you. Thank you for what was a pretty lengthy and heartfelt intro. I don't think any of us were ready. And that allows us the opportunity to intro David Enrich, who wrote a little book called Servants of the Damned last year that was interesting enough that we thought it made sense to all speak together. The book is largely about the law firm Jones Day. If you've been through OCI, you might have spoken to one of their awful partners. But the book was sort of the story of their rise to the top of the conservative legal movement. We thought it made sense for us to discuss it with you, David, and I kind of want to hand it off to you. I mean, the book is in large part about the trip that Jones Day takes from a relatively conservative, even Republican law firm into the pinnacle of the Republican Party, right? Into a firm that is so intertwined with the Trump administration that at the top they're not really different things in a lot of ways. So I think it makes sense to maybe have you give an overview of the story and let me know if this sort of characterization makes sense. I mean, when I read your book, and what seems to have happened is that this kind of normal conservative law firm that represents a bunch of horrific corporations and things like that rolls the dice on Donald Trump in 2016, joins up to represent the campaign, and when Trump wins, all of a sudden they are in the halls of power and are maybe the most powerful law firm in the country. So I don't know, I want to know if that characterization is right and how you see the sort of trajectory of this firm from its sort of early stages and even from the early 2000s through the modern era.
Great. Well, first of all, the answer is yes, I agree with that characterization, but before I go any further, I would just like to thank you guys for having us here. The last time I did an event at a law school, Jones Day got wind of it and sent a threatening letter to the organizers, urging them not to have me. So hopefully that didn't happen here. And if it did, I'm glad you didn't tell me about it because it stresses me out. So yeah, Jones Day was founded in the late 1800s in Cleveland. For a long time, it was just kind of a traditional corporate law firm specializing in litigation in defense of big companies, especially in the Midwest. There were a lot of big industrial companies, General Motors, companies like that. It grew, it started expanding all over the country in the 70s and 80s as part of kind of a trend that was occurring in the legal profession at the time, and then started going overseas as well, so that by 2000, it was one of the biggest law firms in the country, more than 2,000 lawyers, more than, I believe, about 40 offices around the world. And it had been run by a series of Republicans, but it was not a Republican law firm. I don't think it would be fair to characterize it that way. It was, there are lots of Democrats who worked there. They were not particularly ideological. And then around that period, in 2003, the firm gets a new managing partner who runs the place, and his name is Steve Brogan. And Brogan is very conservative and very headstrong and very ambitious. And so among the big things that he starts to do is recruit a lot of similarly conservative, kind of FedSoc, from a FedSoc mold, if not literally from FedSoc, a lot of people to the upper echelons of the firm and also to the kind of most influential areas in the practice groups within the firm, including the group called Issues and Appeals, which, as the name implies, is an appellate practice that focuses in large part on bringing cases to important federal appeals courts and ideally to the Supreme Court. And they played a big role in one of their kind of leading causes in the Obama era was leading the effort on multiple legal fronts to invalidate Obamacare, whether it was challenging the insurance exchanges or fighting the ban on that employers have to cover contraception for their employees under their health plans. And most of these cases didn't really succeed that well, so their influence was not as great as it is now. And the Obamacare cases are a case in point of that. Most of them they lost at the Supreme Court. And but in 2014, they made a very fateful decision. Brogan did, which was that instead of kind of sitting on the sidelines of politics, they were going to create a new political law practice. And to do that, they hired this team of kind of hotshot Republican lawyers from patent bogs. It's a guy named Don McGahn, Ben Ginsberg, and another guy, his name doesn't matter. Sorry, Bill McGinley. And they came over at the end of 2014. In early 2015, the presidential campaign is just getting underway. And so this group of lawyers has free rein to basically start advertising that they are here to advise any would-be Republican presidential nominee who would like their services. And so they get a bunch of people at first. And there is Chris Christie was on their list, Scott Perry, the Texas governor, was there, and a guy named Donald Trump, who happened to have a connection going back generations with Don McGahn's family. And so, yeah, on basically, and I wouldn't say they gambled that Trump would win. I don't think they had any inkling that Trump would win, but they wanted a Republican winner. And so they threw their hat in the ring with Trump, among others. And we all know what happened. But along the way, Jones Day played this absolutely pivotal role in not only advancing the Trump campaign just by keeping it generally in compliance with campaign finance and election rules and things like that, but really cementing and solidifying its credibility in the Republican establishment through things like the creation of the list, which I assume most people know about, but it was basically Trump publicly committing to certain Supreme Court or to pick from a list of kind of Federalist Society pre-approved Supreme Court justices. And I'm cognizant I'm just kind of going on here, so feel free to interrupt me here. But that was a kind of a key turning point, I think, in the Trump campaign. No less an authority than Mitch McConnell has credited the creation of the list, which literally took place in Jones Day's offices. It was kind of masterminded by Don McGahn. Mitch McConnell said that was the moment that the Republican establishment realized that here was a guy they could support and they could rally behind, even though just a few years earlier he had been very wishy-washy on issues like abortion.
Get our name out there too and establish our credibility with establishment forces is by putting out a list of Supreme Court nominees, and I think it's going to work. I think we're going to get some Trump levels of power.
And a serious point. I did want to continue with that. I feel like when I was reading the book, you sort of make the case not just that Jones Day sort of advised and hitched their wagon to Trump, but in some ways made Trump. That the campaign was very fly-by-night, and they didn't really know what they were doing. They weren't very professional and weren't getting along with the Republican establishment. And Jones Day sort of made all that happen for them, turned it into a real campaign, and meshed with the Republican Party. Is that
yeah,
correct?
I mean, I don't want to overstate the professionalism of the campaign. I mean, this is seriously, it was like even in victory, it was a complete shit show, right? But it definitely, Jones Day and Don McGahn in particular played this absolutely crucial role bridging the kind of wide gap between someone who is not just like a combustible and unpredictable and inconsistent candidate, but also someone who is running against the political establishment, right? And here he has Don McGahn in his corner, and McGahn is the embodiment of the political establishment. This is a guy who had worked for basically a who's who, and Ben Ginsberg too. They had worked for a who's who of Republican candidates and party apparatuses and other causes for decades. And McGahn had been the chairman of the Federal Election Commission, presiding over the watering down of campaign finance law. So he's a very well-known quantity on Capitol Hill, at organizations like the Federalist Society, and just in kind of the Republican firmament. So, I mean, they played an essential role really building up Trump's credibility and allowing people like Mitch McConnell to have a lot of comfort that this was someone that they could kind of go to bat for. And even when things like, I mean, I don't remember exactly when this was, but when was Trump's, like, the video that came out right before the election of, Trump boasting about sexually assaulting people? Like, at moments like that, you could see people tiptoeing away, but you also knew that in their heart of hearts, they actually believed that with Don McGahn behind the scenes, that someone like Trump, for all his many flaws, was someone that was probably going to come in and do the thing that was most important to them, which was, and there was a Supreme Court vacancy right there waiting for them, and because of Scalia's death. And so this was a huge priority for the conservative movement and the Republican Party. And I think that despite all of Trump's many, many foibles, they felt comfortable committing and recommitting to him.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit? I think something that was really illuminating for me in the book is about the sort of close personal ties that other lawyers at Jones Day who are bringing cases to the Supreme Court, right, have, not just with the political establishment, not just through the Trump campaign, but also direct connections with the Supreme Court justices themselves.
One of my favorite anecdotes from the book, unfortunately, didn't make it into the book because it happened after the book had physically been printed. But the day after the Dobbs decision, back, what was that, June, I guess, or July, there was a party at a home right on the Long Island Sound in Westchester County, New York, which happens to be near where I live. And the party was thrown by one of the top lawyers at Jones Day, a woman who ran, at that point, their issues and appeals practice. And it was a 50th birthday party for her husband. And one of the guests there, this is the day after Roe was overturned, was Amy Coney Barrett. And Amy Coney Barrett was there because she knew these people, because they'd all clerked together for various federal judges and Supreme Court justices over the years. And also there was a guy named Noel Francisco, who until recently had been the Solicitor General in the Trump administration and had returned to his previous home at Jones Day. And between the two Jones Day partners, among many others who were there, these were the people responsible for arguing Jones Day's cases before the Supreme Court, including one that at that moment was pending before the court. It was the West Virginia versus EPA case that the court ended up kind of neutering the power of federal agencies to regulate things like the environment. And so I actually saw a picture of this afterwards, that there is Noel Francisco and Amy Coney Barrett kind of sitting in a corner together, chit-chatting. This case literally is pending before the court, and 5 days after this party, the case comes down. Lo and behold, it's in favor of Jones Day's client. And I'm not suggesting that there's any connection between literally what they were talking about at the party and the decision, which I'm sure was already written. But to me, that was just such like a vivid illustration of the cozy, maybe some would say incestuous relationship between not just members of the corporate bar and the judges and justices that they are arguing for, but also like in the conservative movement, they have done a really, really good job of building a network, building a community, and kind of staying connected and cultivating those ties to such an extent that a Supreme Court justice thinks it's appropriate to go party with the people who are arguing at that moment before their court. I don't know if that I forgot what your question was, but I really wanted to tell that story.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's an example of what I was asking about. Yeah.
And so I think that also makes me think of something I was thinking reading your book is, it's about Jones Day, but it's also about the transformation of corporate practice in general in the 1900s, especially the latter half of the century. And I think something I walked away with was the idea, maybe, I don't think you ever explicitly say this, but that this was sort of the point, right? This is like the idea, this is the culture that they've been building by deregulating and, sort of unchaining business, loosening lawyer ethics rules, loosening advertising rules, creating profit incentives, essentially that this this has been the goal, is to create a world where there's this sort of incestuous purchased influence. I don't know, is that fair?
I don't know if that's fair, honestly. I mean, I don't know if it's fair to call that the goal. That's certainly the effect. I think that there, as with the case with like basically everything in the world, like things are subtle and there are a lot of shades of gray, and they happen bit by bit in ways that you don't really recognize what's happening at the time. You guys on a recent podcast kind of got into this with someone who I guess you had criticized previously, and you kind of apologized for it because it was like in the moment you don't realize quite what you're doing or the outcome it's going to have 50 or 100 years down the road. But I mean, there's no doubt, first of all, members of the corporate bar, by and large, did set out and have consistently set out to make the law and the interpretation of the law much more favorable to their clients. I don't even really blame them for that, right? Like that's just, they're advocating for their clients, and the effect is that, you know, their clients are often accused of doing terrible things. And as a result of the increasing power of the corporate bar, it is harder and harder and harder to actually successfully bring cases and seek justice against those companies when they do bad things. And I'm not sure to what extent that's deliberate or just kind of a beneficial coincidence. I mean, I just don't know.
All right.
I want to be clear that we didn't actually apologize to Rick Pildes. We just, sort of equivocated a bit about our criticism. I don't want us to sound weak on a recorded episode.
There's nothing weak with apologizing when you're wrong, Peter.
Bringing it back to, the ties to the Trump campaign, the representation of the Trump campaign, I wonder if people would be interested just to hear about the 2020 election and Jones Day's role there.
Yeah, I mean, it was just kind of a crazy situation. So Jones Day represents the 2016 campaign. Trump wins. And I think the important kind of context is that a whole lot of officials or lawyers from Jones Day, Don McGahn gets named White House counsel, and he basically imports his political law team from Jones Day and brings them into the White House counsel's office. So there were probably 10 or 12 lawyers in the White House counsel's office who had been on Jones Day's staff. They go into the White House. The upper echelons of the Justice Department are just stocked with Jones Day people. There are senior people at other agencies as well, like the Commerce Department and some others I can't even remember. And so there's this huge exodus of talent from Jones Day into the Trump administration, which is it's not uncommon for administrations, whether they're Republican or Democrat, frankly, to draw very heavily from corporate law firms. But this was a really extraordinary kind of transfer of power from one particular firm into one particular administration. And so over the years, and they played a very influential role, not just in reshaping the federal judiciary. And McGahn had the sole power granted to him by Trump to come up with lists of nominees, not just to the Supreme Court, but to the entire federal bench. And he did that with great kind of like military-like precision and devotion. But anyway, after a few years, a bunch of these people left the Trump administration and came back to Jones Day. Jones Day began, and meanwhile, Trump had filed his papers for re-election the day he was inaugurated in 2017. And so Jones Day all along, his staff is working on his 2016 campaign still, which has all these legal issues like the Mueller investigation, among other things, and is also the outside counsel for his 2020 campaign. And I don't think it was a decision that Jones Day paid a whole lot of attention to stay on with the Trump campaign, and I think there was a little bit of internal debate, but not a whole lot. But by early 2020, maybe by mid-2020, Trump's rhetoric was veering in an especially autocratic, anti-democratic direction, and he was, as I'm sure everyone knows, warning over and over again with no basis in fact about the risks of fraud, the risks if he didn't win, the election would inevitably have been rigged. And a bunch of people inside Jones Day started finally, after 5 years of representing the guy, started to feel pangs of their conscience. And one of those people in particular was Ben Ginsberg, who is of course the senior Republican lawyer who'd come over with Don McGahn 5 or 6 years earlier. And he voiced these concerns to Steve Brogan, the head of the firm, on a couple of occasions at least, basically saying, there comes a point at which the rhetoric of our client starts to matter. And when he is clearly laying the groundwork to not stand by the election, that is maybe something we should think about, the reputational damage it might inflict on our firm if we're not careful. And as you can probably imagine, those concerns, I don't know if they fell on deaf ears, but they certainly did not result in any change to how Jones Day was handling itself. And lo and behold, Trump loses the election and persists in trying to overturn the election unlawfully. And so Jones Day Ginsburg, by the way, a month or two before the election, ends up resigning from the firm, basically in protest, saying he doesn't want his last political campaign to involve a demagogue destroying democracy. Jones Day was not involved in the crazed Sidney Powell-esque legal challenges after the election. What they were involved in was some very important litigation in Pennsylvania, where the Republican Party had challenged how they were going to the timing and the kind of credentialing of absentee and mail-in ballots. And Jones Day, on behalf of the Republican Party and then later on behalf of Trump, went out basically to make it as hard as possible for absentee and mail-in ballots to count in Pennsylvania. And that seems like a little, with the benefit of 3 years of memory loss in a pandemic and stuff like that, that seems maybe not that important. But you have to remember that this is in the middle of the pandemic. There's a lot of concern about people physically going to polling places to vote. Pennsylvania was a crucial swing state. And so there was a real, and absentee and mail-in ballots were expected to skew very heavily toward Biden. And so Jones Day took a very clear approach, which is that they were going to make it as hard as possible for those likely Democratic ballots to count. And this finally, after years of representing Trump, finally led people at Jones Day to kind of throw up their arms and protest. There was a series of conference calls that were held where people were, outwardly rebelling, which is very unusual at a firm like Jones Day, which is a very hierarchical kind of, I don't want to say dictatorial culture, but kind of a dictatorial culture, and where dissent is not always encouraged. And so it was a pretty extraordinary moment for the firm. Did it change anything there? I don't think it really did, to be honest with you. I mean, they took great pride, and I think still do take great pride in representing unpopular, polarizing clients. And Brogan, who just now has retired finally after 20 years in charge, it seems to derive pure pleasure from thumbing his nose at the kind of political and media establishment. And yeah.
Cute. I just
funny. I like it.
Thanks, David. I just want to make another note. I don't have a question. I think Peter might, but I just want to make another note about the importance of that litigation in Pennsylvania. Is that is a kind of iteration, a sort of maybe baby argument that ends up kind of rolling into independent state legislature theory, right? Which is now in front of the Supreme Court this term.
Yeah, it also came the court was poised to buy a lot of these arguments, potentially write off a bunch of absentee ballots. They basically punted the issue, but left it available to themselves in the event that it became decisive. So there was the election ended up being too decisive to fuck with, but the possibility was very real that they could have won that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And look, I think, and this is kind of a hallmark trait of certainly of Jones Day, maybe of corporate law firms, or maybe all law firms, I don't know. But they took that case and litigated that case because they wanted to win it, and they were hopeful, I think, that it would flip Pennsylvania. But they also, they do these cases with a real view toward the long term, and in terms of setting precedent, not just for the particular facts or laws at stake, but kind of to lay the groundwork for future appeals and future cases that they hope will set precedent. And this is something that Jones Day, and again, I'm maybe unfairly singling them out here, I don't know, but they're just very methodical about it. And it's the same, it's a system that they have learned over years of high stakes corporate litigation. The tobacco, that they were and remain R.J. Reynolds' primary outside lawyer. And it was those are battles that taught them a lot about laying the groundwork effectively for appeals, slowing down the legal process, and using using defeats to translate into long-term victories. And so I think they attacked this with a lot of forethought and with an aim toward being able to use not just that case, but the type of legal arguments they were making to advance their agenda in future venues.
I do want to talk a little bit before we sort of move on into bigger picture discussions. I would like to just talk a little bit of shit about Jones Day if we can.
Yeah, I think we.
Yeah, because I mean, there are a lot of there are law students here. There are certainly some just listening to the podcast, and they are like one of the worst places for a lawyer to work if you're not a partner. And back in my day, folks, that was sort of like common knowledge. And what I mean by the worst place is not necessarily that the culture is particularly grueling, because you can see that all over the industry, but associates are underpaid relative to their peers. They don't get bonuses. There is no transparency on the pay scale, which is like very unusual for big law. I mean, big law is a pretty clear trade. Your time and your morals, and then money in exchange. And Jones Day doesn't even guarantee the money. It's a very sort of bizarre dynamic. They've been intertwined with like the worst corporations on earth for years. You mentioned tobacco companies. A friend of mine who worked there told me that the managing partner in Dallas had an office at Raytheon HQ. Like just demonic. Just, a caricature of an evil place, but also a place that like does not even respect the associates doing the work for them. I don't know. I don't even have anything poignant to say about that. It just seems like they are as awful to everyone in their vicinity as they can possibly be at all times.
Well, David, I do think you know a little bit about like that culture of like churning people, right? Last week when we spoke, you talked about how they sort of reserve huge bonuses for Supreme Court clerks.
Yeah, I mean, they do. I'm sure many of you already know this, but there's a frenzied effort by many law firms to attract Supreme Court clerks and hire them. And I think that it's kind of, everyone gives the same going rate in terms of the signing bonuses, which are astronomical. And I think it's now like $450,000 signing bonus. Which ends up meaning that the clerk ends up making substantially more than the Supreme Court justice in their first year at a law firm. Jones Day, though...
I don't want to implicitly advocate for raising Supreme Court justice.
Jones Day snaps up as many clerks as they can. They've literally said that they want as many as they can get, and I think... they've been very effective at doing that. They year in and year out get more clerks than anyone else, and more Supreme Court clerks than anyone else. And it's an interesting question why they do that, I think, which is not, the answer is not entirely clear to me. And they say it just makes business sense. And well, why? And this is a firm that has an extensive practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. Every term they have at least a couple of major cases that they're arguing. So maybe it gives them knowledge of how the justices think. Maybe it's kind of good for marketing purposes. I don't know. It's kind of a racket, though, in part because a lot of these clerks who go there, they have to stick around for at least 2 years, but many of them leave right afterwards because they don't have any interest in working at Jones Day.
Right, because of the size of the bonus. It's often clerks who have clerked for liberal justices, right, who go and then just do the 2 years and leave, and the firm knows and expects this.
Well, yeah, just to be clear, the liberal justices thing is a little bit of a red herring. I mean, that's the argument Jones Day made to me when I was asking about this, that, well, look, you say we're a conservative law firm. No, we're not. We have hired, like, all of these clerks from liberal justices. And I actually went back over 30 years and counted. And first of all, 2/3 of their clerks have come from conservative justices. In the past several years, every single one of their clerks, or at least the past couple of years, every single one of their clerks has come from conservative justices. And the liberal clerks who do come, there is a tendency of them to, as you said, stick around for 2 or 3 years and then bail. And yeah, I mean, I think if you're a Supreme Court clerk, that may well be the economically rational thing to do if you're just looking at this purely in terms of maximizing your money.
Yeah, I do think firms like that my experience with them is that they do get value even when associates leave, just from having personal connections with people who they think will likely end up, being important, right? Being in government, being in the DOJ, being in administration, working in Congress or whatever, which Supreme Court clerks are likely to do. Now they have a personal relationship with someone, right?
To me, though, it's a manifestation of something broader going on at Jones Day and probably other firms, which is that the leadership of those firms is thinking, again, very methodically, long-term about building a network that is useful to them, not just for their clients' purposes in winning cases, but to pursue the ideological goals
Yes.
of their leaders and their most important experienced partners. And Jones Day stands out, I think, in the corporate bar as being especially conservative, but I think this is the spectrum of ideology across big corporate law firms is maybe not that wide. And I imagine that that's kind of this, whether it's the intent or not, it has the effect of everyone in this space is kind of interacting with the same very exclusive group of people, and those are people who are kind of making the law, interpreting the law, arguing the law, and I don't think it's a coincidence that you then see the outcomes in so many cases skewing in a particular direction.
Yeah, it's interesting you said across the spectrum of big law, because I think the book is about Jones Day, but you try to show that it's just one of many, right? And you talk about Baker McKenzie, talk about Gibson Dunn, Paul Weiss, a bunch of different firms. But I noticed my alma mater, Sullivan Cromwell, didn't get a mention. So do you think it's fair to say that I'm like
sorry to disappoint you.
morally blameless? If I did pro bono, maybe I'm morally praiseworthy for my work at...
I hereby award you praise. Moral praise.
Wow.
I knew it.
A beautiful moment. I think it makes sense to sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about big law in generally, because the book covers an interesting narrative that takes place mostly in the 70s, where you have a series of free speech oriented challenges to restrictions on like lawyer advertising, et cetera, that completely change the profession and get the ball rolling in a weird way, where you have then lawyers competing for clients. You get a culture of competition that spawns things like American Lawyer, which then sort of feeds into this this cycle.
Not just the entity,
right? Not just the content of the American Lawyer. And yeah, you have this sort of reinforcing loop where lawyers are chasing after clients, accumulating power, law firms are getting bigger, and that sort of leads us to modern big law. So I just think it would be useful for everyone if you could sort of just walk through like what happened there.
Yeah, well, it's complicated, and there's like lots of different things kind of converging on one point. And first of all, I'm not a lawyer, in case that wasn't obvious.
Smartest person up here.
So I had no idea that there was a day not that long ago, really, where like law firms and lawyers couldn't advertise. I have like been on many highways and I see many advertisements, and I just assumed that was the way the world always worked. And I assume most of you know that's not the way the world always worked. But there was a couple of Supreme Court decisions in the 70s that, they're interesting decisions because on their face, they seemed kind of, or at least I could get where the justices and where the plaintiffs in those cases were coming from. And the most important one was Bates versus State Bar of Arizona. And Bates he and a colleague from law school had set up a legal clinic providing basically cut-rate legal services in Phoenix to poor people. And there was just two guys, basically. They had no way to get the word out. And at the time, state and local bar associations had enacted prohibitions on advertising. So that meant the normal way to get the word out would be, you run an ad in the newspaper or on TV. Well, you weren't allowed to do that. You weren't even allowed to basically go and ask a reporter at the local newspaper, hey, do you want to write a story about this cool new legal clinic? You just couldn't do that. You would run afoul of these bar association rules. And so Bates and his partner, Van Osteen, decided, what do we have to lose? Fuck it. We're just going to run an ad and see what happens. And so they ran this little ad in the Phoenix newspaper. And sure enough, the Bar Association filed a complaint. They were going to be basically have their law licenses revoked. And this case ended up going up all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled that restrictions on lawyer advertising violated the First Amendment. And this was one of a kind of a series of cases in that era that were brought by Nader acolytes, actually, it was widely viewed as a victory for kind of people that were trying to break up established monopolies like that existed in the legal system.
They were arguing it's sort of anti-competitive, right? That if you're a small lawyer trying to get off the ground and you can't solicit, what are you supposed to do? It's a built-in benefit for large firms.
Yeah, it was a built-in benefit, and the law firms, the big law firms, were literally colluding. Like, they would set prices together with the help of the Bar Association. So it was not, and it was a way of locking out competitors, and it harmed clients also, right? Because it prevented competition to reduce prices. So these were bad things. The result of this decision, though, which was not unanticipated. I think it was Rehnquist, actually, who had this dissent that proved, I think, very farsighted, which was that this decision was going to set off not just an arms race in the legal industry, which it did, but in all sorts of industries. Like, it opened the door to drug companies running advertisements, for example. And anyway, in the legal industry, it meant that lawyers could not only run ads, which they quickly began to do, but they could also start kind of promoting their services in a whole variety of ways, whether that meant handing out business cards or talking to the media or even soliciting clients and kind of coming up with strategies to solicit clients. And so it kind of was the starter's pistol on law firms becoming much more proactive in marketing themselves and selling themselves, and that incentivized them to get bigger so that they could attract more clients all over the country. And when you start getting bigger, you need, if you don't want to like dilute the amount of money you're paying to your partners, you need to hire more people so you can take on more cases and take on more assignments. And then you have more people on the partner track, which means you need to expand the pie further. And it's like round and round we go. And I don't think that was like the sole thing that kickstarted this, but it was definitely an important force. And you talk to a lot of like old corporate lawyers, and they remember this moment in the late 70s, early 80s, when all of a sudden they could go out and issue press releases and go out and like talk to their buddy at the American Lawyer magazine and kind of boast about the way they were winning these clients. And at the same time, there was the creation of this specialized legal press that was built around, I mean, it wasn't well, I don't think the people behind it would have said that they were designing it to celebrate like corporate lawyers, but that was definitely the effect. And it ranged from like, it was kind of like treating corporate lawyers the way you would treat like an NBA star in terms of the coverage. And they also started publishing all these rankings of law firms by various profitability metrics, which would not have been possible for them to do a few years earlier when it was off limits in most places to even for a lawyer to talk to the media about anything about their firm, really. And so it created this very visible public race to have the most profits per partner, to have the most offices, to have your top lawyers profiled in the American Lawyer. And I think in hindsight, there's no question that was a kind of a crucial turning point for the industry. Well, I've left you speechless. That's terrible.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, on the topic of sort of ethical responsibility, professional responsibility, Jones Day told you, and this is not uncommon across big law, Jones Day told you something specific about why they represent the unpopular, let's say, destructive, I'll say, evil, I'll say, corporations that they represent. Johnson & Johnson among them, whose products cause cancer. We talked about big tobacco, many other, the list goes on and on. But they say something interesting about legal ethics for why they take these clients.
They are very patriotic. Everyone is entitled to legal representation. Yeah. Don't you know that, Rhea? God, did you go to law school? Of course. Everyone deserves representation, no matter what. And the more heinous the client or the more heinous the client's crimes, the more they deserve legal representation.
Right.
And this is something, honestly, I heard from many, many, many people at Jones Day, but also from everyone. Everyone I talked to about this book is like, but wait, everyone deserves legal representation. You're attacking these poor lawyers for just doing their jobs and zealously representing clients. And actually, the first time I've been hearing this argument since like the moment I started working on this book, but it gave me, I had to, again, I'm not a lawyer, I didn't go to law school. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that and talking to people about that. And I just think it's like, there's obviously some truth to the argument, but it's like been perverted in this way, especially by big law, to just go way beyond the entitlement to counsel under the Sixth Amendment. Like where, if you're an accused criminal, a human criminal, you have a right to zealous representation, which often you don't get because so many of the good lawyers from places like Harvard Law School are going to big law firms where they don't represent individual clients. I could talk about this for hours. So maybe give me some direction.
Yeah, no, I thought sort of a compelling point you made was that so much of what big law firms do now doesn't fit in any, even of the most abstract idea of what like lawyer advocacy and zealous representation even is, right? Like David Boies hiring like Mossad agents or whatever to harass victims of sexual assaults, right? That's not a lawyer. That's not lawyering, right? Like in any sense.
And that's like, that's just the tip of the iceberg.
That's the zealousness.
Yeah, and there is, if you like stipulate that corporations, like people, deserve zealous legal representation when they're accused of crimes, or even when they're accused of any sort of wrongdoing. Like, so then let's pretend that includes civil cases, which it doesn't for humans. But even in that context, like, there is no constitutional or ethical entitlement to having a good law firm helping you avoid taxes, or hide money, or lobby for a law, or threaten witnesses, or intimidate plaintiffs, or, on and on we go. Big law firms, that is a lot of what they do, and not even in an illegal or legally improper way. It's just like the modern big law firm on the corporate side is not specializing in defending individuals or even institutions that are accused of wrongdoing. They are helping at every turn figure out creative, complicated ways for companies to avoid adhering to the letter, or at least to the spirit, if not the letter of the law, and to hide their money and manage their money in ways that is outside the reach of tax authorities. And those are just not things that you have any right to. Nor do you have a right, if you're a politician, to the best political lawyers in the country. That you just do not have that right. And the law firms like Jones Day, but by no means limited to them, have mastered this argument of, we not only is what we are doing constitutionally protected and kind of patriotic, but you questioning that, like you journalists questioning that, are betraying a complete ignorance of the Constitution and the kind of the standards of the legal profession. So you should shut up and go to law school. And that's effective, by the way. Like, for people who are not lawyers, like, I've been doing journalism for a long time, so I've kind of learned to just, like, when people say things like you're an idiot, you don't understand how it works, to, like, not pay attention to that. But, like, I think that's part of the reason that big corporate law firms are not written about as much as they deserve to be in major mainstream news organizations. I work at the New York Times, and I love the New York Times, but we have generally failed over the years at writing investigative pieces and just scrutinizing the inner working of these firms, which are multi-billion-dollar institutions. And if they were in any other sector of the economy or in any other kind of place in society, we would be going nuts on this. We would be really digging in. We have teams of reporters covering these places, and we just don't, and neither do our competitors. And I think it's in part because these lawyers have really been so effective at taking this simple argument that everyone who's accused of a crime is entitled to lawyers to cover the whole waterfront of shit that they do that has nothing to do with what the Constitution actually says.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation because I don't even think that I disagree with like the theoretical principle everyone deserves representation. The real problem is that it's this abstract theoretical conversation that is overlapping with a really practical one, right? Not everyone gets representation. And if you are Jones Day, you are choosing to some degree who your clients are, just like your clients are choosing you. That might be something that's defensible if literally no one else was representing Donald Trump or willing to, and then you were assigned by a court, right, Donald Trump as a client. They are purposefully choosing clients like Donald Trump, like tobacco companies, weapons companies, because those companies are wealthy, right? This is
and it's not like they're just sitting there waiting and being like, let's see who comes in our office today seeking legal representation.
Right.
They're actively out there designing legal strategies to market to particular companies and particular industries that they want to attract. So it is not, there's no passivity to it. And I think the notion that they're peddling, that, and not just Jones Day, all of these law firms are peddling, is predicated on there being some kind of, that we are passively, of course we're not going to turn away a client. Come on, you went out and sought that client. You did everything in your power to make yourself and your legal strategies not just attractive to those clients, but known to those clients. And so you're peddling this. You can't.
You're also not. I mean, you are. There are people without lawyers who need lawyers, right? You're not seeking them out, and if you're not seeking them out to try to fulfill,
R.J. Reynolds had attorneys.
Right.
Has always had attorneys.
Right. It just feels like turning a really material discussion about who needs lawyers and what they need them for into a sort of reflexive defense of taking up representation for anyone, for any purpose, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think that, just one other thing about this, and then I'll, the notion, there's no doubt that like the legal system is built on this representation, or on this notion that zealous representation of all sides, everyone makes their argument in front of a judge or a jury as strongly and forcefully as possible, and then you have impartial jurists make a decision based on the facts as forcefully presented. That, like in theory, works really well, but it's based on this idea that, and I think it hinges on this idea, that there is some symmetry between the two sides, and that the power of the plaintiff versus the defendant have similar resources, similar time constraints, similar financial constraints, and that is just not how it works, right? We had this panel up here earlier of people from big plaintiffs' firms. The reality is that most of these cases that in which someone or something is suing a big company, it's not a fair fight at all. It is not. It's lopsided, and I've seen this happen over and over and over again, where firms like Jones Day, but by no means limited to them, go in and they're just steamrolling their opponents, not on the strength of their arguments necessarily, but based on the paperwork that they're filing, the motions they're filing, the depositions they're doing, and
the time that they can spend, right? If you're someone without resources and you need a lawyer, you're likely going to get a lawyer who's cheaper, who's a little bit overworked, who's going to spend considerably less time on your case, right? If you're in big law, you will see clients spend tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars on cases worth $25,000 because they do it as a matter of principle and practice and for sort of bigger picture reasons. And there's no way that a lawyer that the other party can afford could ever compete with that. They don't have the time and resources.
And this is in part, like, these are not just like random unrelated forces, right? The fact that it is so hard for plaintiffs in like product liability cases often to find good, competent lawyers, or people who are accused of crimes to find good, competent lawyers, that's not just unrelated to the fact that these corporate law firms are so big and so rich. And they are hiring at places like this school 70% of graduates, and that means that 30% are spread very thinly across a much larger kind of area of law. And so these are very
I don't want to give Harvard law students too much credit here.
You get the point. I'm still like from the outsider point of view where I'm like, I'm at Harvard Law. It's like very exciting and awing to me. You guys,
no, it's cursed, David.
Yeah, I'm getting that sense. That was news to me.
And if you're attending this, you are in the bottom of the class.
You know,
the kids in the top 5% are interviewing for Supreme Court clerkships right now.
The rest of us are sitting here on a Saturday.
You know, on the topic of legal ethics, the ethics of representation. All big law firms do this. Jones Day touts it a lot. Let's talk about pro bono time, right? So I was on the Jones Day website. They boast about their quote-unquote border project that the firm has launched in South Texas.
By the way, we should clarify, the Border Project does do good work. They
It does,
are,
yes.
I know it sounds, when you think
I'm
Trump administration,
explaining.
Border Project. No, I know. Okay. I thought you were going to move on to the next project.
No,
I wanted
no,
to
no.
explain that it's real pro bono.
The firm has launched this project in South Texas. They say they have provided legal education to over 10,000 migrants. They have managed more than 600 individual cases for women, children, and families. And they have had 1,100 lawyers from Jones Day working nearly 300,000 hours on these cases. Okay, so there's that. And then the pro bono site for Jones Day also lists other projects, including a real vague paragraph about support for Ukraine. They also combat human trafficking, and then there's
Because
a
that's
project.
the QAnon pro bono project.
Right. And then there's a project, quote, advancing the rule of law in Africa. So, David, are they absolved? They do so much pro bono.
No, they're not absolved. But I will just I'm sorry to play straight man here. The Border Project is a real thing, and it has saved lives. It's a really good piece of pro bono work that they have done. They're representing thousands of undocumented migrants who have been trapped in lawless detention centers.
By the policies of
The Trump administration, but that exists. I know.
it's also-
I'm not. I know I'm not.
That was an
talking to the
anti-Enrich
audience
round of
here.
applause, by the way.
That is a problem that the Trump administration undoubtedly hugely exacerbated, but existed prior to the arrival of Donald Trump. But anyway, yes, to get back to your point, they do some good pro bono work, for sure. What they don't have on the funny thing is, when I started this project, I would hear through word of mouth about the great things they were doing on the border, and I went to them and I was like, look, will you talk to me about the great things you're doing? Because I genuinely wanted to understand what the firm was doing that was good, what was bad, and they were like, we are not going to talk to you about that because we don't like to boast. We're doing this. They cited some religious saying that I've long forgotten about how you do good works and you don't boast about them. And I was like, okay, well, but I'm writing a book about you, and I want to capture the good stuff as well. And they're like, we're not going to talk to you about this. Anyway, the book is finishing. As far as I could tell, they redesigned their website to start boasting about this stuff. One of their partners sent me this very glossy brochure that outlined some of the things you just listed, as well as a whole bunch of other things that seemed like really good, important pro bono work. What you will not find on any, or at least I have been unable to find on that brochure or on their website, is any mention of the other pro bono work they're doing, which is that they represent interest groups and think tanks that are funded by big corporate interests or billionaires that are doing things that run very much counter to the ideals they're espousing on the pro bono section of their website. And they have done pro bono work attacking the Affordable Care Act, attacking voting rights, and the list goes on, and I don't have it all off the top of my head, but they have, so I talked to some of their lawyers about that, and I said, it certainly doesn't seem to adhere to ABA guidelines of what constitutes pro bono work, where you're providing services to people or institutions that are financially in need. And they said, well, the ABA is full of shit, basically. And anyway, our definition of pro bono is that it's free and that it's for good. And our definition of good is
advancing the rule of law in Africa. You don't know what that is, do you? If someone can ever find out what Jones Day means by advancing the rule of law in Africa, one of the most unsettling phrases I've ever heard in my life.
You can guest on the show if you know. Yeah.
I do not know, but I bet it's not as bad as you're implying, would be my guess, because they use these things. I don't want to use that word. The effect of what they're doing with these things, and the reason they're boasting about it on their website, is that they're trying to create an image out there that the very kind of polarizing, controversial, some would say bad, work that they're doing for giant companies, those profits that they are reaping from that are being recycled into acts of good that we want to boast about. And you can just, again, stipulate that they are doing some good stuff, good pro bono stuff. I think they are. That does not, they've also contorted themselves to find ways to take credit for doing pro bono work in terms of the hours that their lawyers are booking, doing things that do not fit the normal definition of what would constitute pro bono work. Like working for Americans for Prosperity and representing them is not, like, that is not a group that is in financial need of their free help.
I can give you a little insight into this as well. I think pro bono practices serve two big functions at law firms. The first is when you're inside, they're very explicit about this, which is it's an opportunity for junior associates to get experience that they would normally have to wait years to get. So you don't have to wait to be a fifth year to lead a deposition or go to trial. You get to do this where you don't have one of their paying clients' asses on the line. Right? And you can go and be before a judge and write a brief that's going to be read by a state Supreme Court.
This is super important because a problem that big law firms have that's sort of easy to not, hard to see from the outside, is that if you are a second year associate with no deposition experience or whatever, right? Philip Morris isn't going to want to be your first trial run, right? So what do you do? You put that kid in a pro bono deposition. They can get some experience that way without a client, a paid client, getting upset about it, or even worse, a paid client demanding that it get written off, right?
Yes,
which is what
awesome.
happens when junior associates do a ton of work that they're a little too underqualified for. So instead of writing it off, let them do pro bono work. It's the same difference plus good PR, right?
Yeah, and then the other thing is that, most people don't go into the law imagining that they're going to be hiring the Mossad to track down sexual assault victims or defending R.J. Reynolds against people who have cancer or...
It's interesting you say that, though. At Jones Day, one of their selling points is they're recruiting young lawyers, is that at a very kind of early age, or early, maybe not age, but like early in your legal career, you will get trial experience. And the reason for that is not the pro bono work. It's that down in Florida, they are dealing with this avalanche of RJR cases.
Right.
And so they are cycling their young associates.
And they're very paint by numbers.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots of template work, and it's taking depositions where they're trying to dig up dirt on the plaintiffs in tobacco litigation cases. So R.J. Reynolds for them is the gift that, and they've been representing them for almost 40 years now, and it's like, it is the gift that keeps on giving, not just in terms of the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're making in fees, but just it gives them, the firm, an opportunity to say to recruits, you are actually going to get trial experience. Yes, it is going to be in the Florida swamp, representing a tobacco company as they try to dig up dirt on people who used their product and died. But it's like, it's trial experience. And so if you really want trial experience, that is off to Florida you go.
Yeah. And then it's a way to reconcile that, right? So you're like, okay, I'm doing something pretty bad, but I'm also helping this family, that's fleeing political violence in South America or whatever. And people need that reconciliation to feel okay with taking, ungodly sums of money, and giving away their soul,
Right.
Yeah.
I have a question for Rhi, because one of the common responses when we're talking like ethics of representation from corporate lawyers representing big corporations is sort of like, well, just like someone who committed a crime needs a public defender, right? So too Raytheon. And I'm be curious in what you think about that sort of line of argument aside from the obvious.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is very broad, but something that's been on my mind really since law school, and I don't think people talk about it enough, is this private-public distinction in the law. We talked about like the evolution of law firms, the practice of law over the course of American history, right? Where it used to be thought of more as a public good. Okay, lawyers have always been bad. I'm not saying that, right? But it used to be thought of as more of a public good, that you were doing public service being a lawyer. And I think the proliferation, if you will, of just the privatization of the practice that it's profit-driven, right, has completely changed, I think, the practice of law and what could be, in general, sort of morally good goals at the center. Specifically, you hear it a lot. Well, you've represented murderers. So you don't have a leg to stand on if you're saying, this law firm also represents bad clients. It's a question about, for me, it's a question about the system. It's a question about material realities for people. It's a question about oppressed and oppressor, right? We are oppressed in this society by these massive corporations that have tons of money, and your common poor person who is accused of crimes, largely you're talking about not just poor, but you're talking about marginalized in other ways, in intersectional ways. They're people of color, they're disabled, they're mentally ill. And so materially, you are talking about giving legal representation to a very, very different client. It's not somebody who has done wrong. You are talking about a corporation built on, profit-driven ideals and fuck everybody else, versus somebody who, has been marginalized and largely failed by every system that is supposed to support them throughout life. And so it is very, very different. It is an honor to stand shoulder to shoulder, stand next to somebody who is too poor to hire an attorney, who is accused by the state of doing something wrong, and there's no honor in the other representation.
Can I make a
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a counter argument, right? In terms of representing corporations, there are different ways of representing a corporation, and I assume you've all read my book by now. But for those who haven't, the book opens with this example in 1944 in Cleveland, where there is the gas company there has built this network of big liquefied natural gas facilities, and one day in 1944, 2 of the tanks explode. And it basically levels this entire neighborhood in Cleveland. It destroys all these houses. A lot of people die. Many more are injured. And so the gas company goes to its law firm, which is Jones Day, and is like, "What do we do?" And so the explosions take place on a Friday morning. And so that weekend, Jones Day, their lawyers hunker down in the library of their law offices and research in the case law and trying to come up with a strategy to present to the gas company. And basically what they come up with is that there are a couple of different options. One is kind of the traditional strategy, which is, you can just go to very great, very effective lengths to basically reduce the amount of money that the gas company whose exploding tanks just caused all this havoc, reduce the amount of money the company is going to have to pay. You can, cast blame elsewhere, whether it's on the steel company that manufactured the tanks, or maybe on the homeowners who didn't fireproof their homes, or the sewer and water authorities whose underground tunnels were conduits for this gas to spread all over the city. You can do things like, prolonging and protracting the litigation, hoping to kind of kick things down the road far enough that people will give up and just accept lowball settlements. It's all sorts of stuff you can do, right? So that's one option. That's not the option, interestingly, that they presented to the gas company. What they said is, if you want to remain in Cleveland, you should do the right thing. And the right thing is you should pay people whose lives you just destroyed. And so the explosion was on a Friday. That Monday, so 2 or 3 days later, the gas company ran an ad in the Plain Dealer newspaper saying, "You come to our offices on Monday, we will write you a check on the spot." And so Jones Day set up in the lobby of this building tables, and they processed all of these claims, and on the spot wrote checks. And it was something like $100 million in today's money that they just wrote. And so I think this is, by the way, 1944, so what is that?
Yeah, and
80
not how
years ago.
how law firms operate today.
It's totally not. And
Today, Jones Day's advice would have been to blow up the rest of Cleveland. So there are no witnesses.
Well, it's seriously, it is they have become masters at doing the exact opposite. They fight tooth and nail against even the most legitimate claims, because they're fearful and their clients are fearful of setting unhelpful precedent, and they are very well equipped and very successful at doing that. But it's not, as I've been working on this project, a lot of people have said, well, this is stupid. Of course law firms are going to do whatever it takes to help their client. And that may be true, but like the conception of what it is that helps a client today we take it as self-evident that that will be something short term, and we're going to do in the immediate term what saves us a buck. I think in the long term, Jones Day's advice to that gas company in 1944 was definitely the right advice, right? That company, it paid out a bunch of money in the short term, but it is still in Cleveland today. It's a big civic booster in Cleveland. It has a really good reputation. The place of the explosion is marked by this really lovely park with a playground. It's like not something that is a huge blemish on the company. In fact, it's credited widely with having done the right thing. And to me, that was probably in the best interest long term of that client. And it is literally the polar opposite of the physical playbook that Jones Day has in his library today that shows you how to attack the plaintiff, how to kind of seek any advantage you can to threaten, not literally threaten, but basically threaten witnesses, and to fight tooth and nail at every turn to destroy your opponent. But I don't think it's a given that that is the way you need. There's no definition of practice in corporate law that involves being evil.
Yeah, I think unless you guys have anything else, that might be a good point to wrap on if we want to have time for a Q&A.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think we're going to wrap our episode, at least our recording here, but we'll start a Q&A session. So, yeah.
Yeah, at least for, 10 minutes? 15? Because
Yeah.
then we need...
Something like
Where's
that.
John?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have some time.
Yeah, we have like 15 minutes.
All right. I don't know how we want to do it.
Well, let's thank David.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess we should thank David.
Thank you guys. I don't even like podcasts, but I'm becoming a fan of yours.
Well, thank you. I thank you not just for doing this, but also for the excellent book. I mean, it's
great.
obviously a ton of work and research. It's super engaging. If you haven't read it, you should pick it up. I mean, I read it in big chunks because I was very captured by it.
Yeah, and it has the story that I think went kind of viral when the book came out of Donald Trump trying to pay a lawyer's fee with a prize stallion.
Yes.
He's
Some
so
stuff
cool.
in there.
Yeah, there's definitely some good stuff in there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
So if you guys are willing to do Q&A, not forcing you guys, if you want to just pick out people and I can hand them the microphones.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just so I don't have to take that responsibility.
Okay.
I know Matt has a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter, Michael, Rhiannon. Really appreciate you coming. Huge fan of the show. And this question actually came to me on Friday during my second day of con law. I was getting some shit from some people in my class for saying Marbury was wrongly decided.
Okay.
So I was wondering what you think about Marbury. Should there be judicial review? What do you think about having 6 unelected officials deciding, basically being a super legislature and deciding what is law in this country? It's not how other countries do it. I was wondering what you think.
That's a leading question.
It was, I'm sorry.
Nice.
I don't even really feel like I have strong opinions on Marbury. We've always said that this will be the last. If we wrap the show on our own terms, that'll be the last episode.
Yeah.
I don't even have strong feelings about it. Every now and then I'll read it, but I don't even really know what's going on in the case, and my general feeling about Marbury is that it's true that other countries don't have judicial review to the degree that we do. It's also true that Marbury isn't really responsible for that in and of itself as much as it's just sort of emblematic of that. And so I would say that I agree broadly that the court's power is, as it stands today, too great, and that there are a lot of intelligent people have written, especially recently, about basically a system of constitutional feedback between the branches, right? And I think that the critique that a lot of those people have laid out is correct, that the legislature has a role to play in determining what is and is not constitutional. So does the executive branch, et cetera. I do think that there's a balance to be struck there. I don't know that Marbury's responsible as much as people say it is, but I don't know, maybe that's wrong.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've seen smart people say that Marbury was wrongly decided. I also don't have strong opinions on it. I think, at least right now, maybe if I started reading about it, I would. But yeah, I think our modern moment is a product of so much more than that, right? Just so much more than this one case that you like learn in your first week of law school and then don't really think about ever again. So changing that doesn't necessarily mean changing our opinions of Marbury. It means maybe just changing our ideas about the president's role in interpreting the Constitution, the legislature's role, and moving more towards like a departmentalism approach to constitutional interpretation rather than judicial supremacy, or however you want to think about it. These are modern problems that call for, I think, modern thinking, not worrying about what some old dudes 200 years ago did when they were just trying to figure things out, right? Like they were muddling through after their first attempt at government had totally collapsed with the Articles of Confederation, and they were just trying to make things work. I don't think that's our guidepost one way or another.
Right.
I'm not equipped to answer. You weren't even going to let me answer, but I don't deserve to answer.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say. I'm reminded of my favorite tweet, which I think I've put, I think I've said this on the podcast before. My favorite tweet of all the time says something like, fuck the Constitution, yellow-ass, torn-ass piece of paper. And that's kind of how I feel about Marbury.
Got someone in the back with the blonde hair.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is regarding kind of basically the system that you just spent the last hour and a half describing of big law being a disaster for our entire country and probably the world. Do you have any ideas of how to fix that long term?
Next question.
Any creative ideas? Any broad thoughts?
I mean, do you guys? Because we're podcasting our asses off over here.
Fair.
I'm happy to take that. I don't know the answer, but I can tell you with part of my goal in writing this book was that I thought there were kind of two audiences among others that I had for this. One is law students and I didn't even know like a community like this existed at Harvard or anywhere else. So this has been a kind of refreshing, very interesting.
You mean like a community of sort of good people? Is that what you're saying?
Those are your words, not mine, Reed. But the other is the media, like the mainstream media. I really wanted to show my colleagues that you could write a book or a magazine article or a newspaper article about an institution like a law firm and make it interesting and compelling and have a narrative around that, and to show that there's a lot to dig into there, and that it should not be, not only should it not be off limits, it should be like, we like in journalism to find good targets to just dig into that have a lot of power and are not often held accountable. And I can think of few more deserving types of target like that than what are scattered throughout the legal industry. So I think that law students in selecting where they take jobs, the media in terms of selecting what they scrutinize and how they do so, can both play big roles in reshaping, at least on the margins, how power is wielded.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also law schools themselves have a role to play in the values they impart to their students. I also do think I've also been reminded of something I saw on Twitter. I don't remember if it was during the Super Bowl or maybe after the insurrection or something, but there was a moment.
Two sides of the same coin.
There was a moment when a lot of people internationally were watching American television, and you could see online, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, them all marveling at pharmaceutical ads. And the fact that pharmaceutical companies were advertising on television, like they were, like, what the fuck is this, right? You can be a developed nation with a vibrant democracy and free speech and not have this sort of unfettered marketplace that we are all mercy to. And that applies to the law as well as pharmaceuticals. We can be a little restrictive on marketplace activity, including marketplace speech, and not be any less free, and in fact, probably be a little more free. Yeah, there are definitely things we can do to rein in the legal industry. We just need the political will to do them.
I mean, there's a degree to which the simplest solution is probably for law schools to stop greasing the wheels of law firms. Like, if you're at law school, you can like stroll into a big law job with almost no effort on your own part. And in fact, if you don't know what you want to do after law school, it becomes almost impossible to not just find yourself in a big law job, because when you get 30 interviews for OCI, and before any other organization, any public interest organization certainly can even approach you, you have an offer for $50,000 for the next summer. What's the rational move? It's hard to argue that it's holding out, right? Yeah. That's because law schools make that sort of thing possible. And I think that the simplest solution, if not, it's not an easy solution, but conceptually simple, is just to have law schools stop doing like de facto advertising for law firms.
Sure. Hey, I'm going to bring the focus back to Jones Day. In full disclosure, I'm a litigating lawyer, and I've had the pleasure of litigating against Jones Day when I sued the Trump campaign, and also representing workers who have been really exploited by companies that Jones Day is defending. And the question really is about oppression and the exploitation, particularly of women and people of color, because I think it's really important to name the role that corporate law firms can have in perpetuating that, both those actions by their clients, but also within their own halls. And I think you've spent a lot of time investigating this particular organization, and it doesn't come as a surprise to me, as someone who has litigated against many of those lawyers, to hear some of the allegations and accusations about gender discrimination and other forms of discrimination against their own, and I just wanted to put that out there and see if that resonates.
Yeah, it absolutely resonates. We haven't talked about it up here, but I have an entire chapter of the book that's about, and there are a bunch of lawsuits that have been filed against the firm for discriminating against their female associates. There are a bunch of things that hadn't been previously reported that I had learned about, including just flagrant racism against some of their own employees, retaliation against their employees. So it is, I'm not sure whether Jones Day deserves to be singled out or picked on in that regard. I'm picking on them because they're the ones I dug into, but I mean, it's a huge problem there, and they got one of the big cases dismissed, and they've used that as kind of a cudgel to beat up anyone, including in the media, who dares mention this problem at the firm. And I mean, it was not that hard for me as an outsider, just talking to people there, to come up with a bunch of other examples. It didn't result in lawsuits because people generally who face discrimination or harassment, it's like a really hard thing to do, to bring a case, and it's maybe not always in their self-interest to do so. But I think it's very important to recognize that kind of stuff there is a lot of it. There may well still be a lot of it at Jones Day, and I suspect that's true at many law firms.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's very internal culture varies from place to place, but I know I heard from some of my friends about other fratty cultures, I think is generally how it's euphemistically described at both left-leaning and right-leaning firms. Not that I have any in-depth reporting to, it's just what people told me, but...
I think there's just a pattern in general that, like, the bigger and more powerful an institution is, and the people atop that institution are, I think there is like probably some strong correlation between that and instances of various types of bad behavior, whether that is sexual harassment and assault or racism or things like that. And I think that's partly because power and money tend to corrupt and tend to create an impression upon people that they can act with impunity and are kind of above the law. And, that's terrible. So, deep thoughts.
We probably have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yeah. Maybe right here.
I can just talk loudly. I think one thing we often hear in law school, especially in response to critiques of powerful institutions or conservative or even mainstream jurisprudence, is to assume good faith. And I'm wondering what you make of that.
I do not think you should assume good faith. I think there's something in academia, especially, where it's considered best practice to always engage in good faith and assume everybody else is engaging in good faith and have good faith debates. I don't think that's a helpful culture when we're talking about the accumulation of political power that's being used to transform the country and enrich people, empower people, and punish people. I think it's very easy to tell when someone is arguing in bad faith. I think most people can pick up on the subtle clues. It's not hard. And if your instinct is telling you that somebody is bullshitting you, you're probably right, and they probably are. And you don't have to pretend like that's not true, right? Like, you don't have to debase yourself because somebody is so shameless that they're going to lie to your face and be like, well, I guess the right thing to do is pretend like they're not and give their comments the most generous reading I possibly can. That's not helpful. They're taking advantage of that. They're taking advantage of that instinct in academics, especially.
Yeah. It insulates the court from outside analysis to some degree, and all courts and the law. Because, of course, if you're not questioning their motives, all sorts of important questions are just out the door. I think a really important way to think about this is not, whether or not you think about whether they're acting in good faith, but what does bad faith look like? Is bad faith someone who is intentionally lying to you, or is it a little more subtle than that? Is bad faith someone who is simply not making an honest effort to locate the truth, or to the best of their ability? I think you see that level of bad faith all the time, and that's what's, I think, important to keep in mind, because I think if you're trying to figure out, is Sam Alito cackling while he writes this and lying to me, right? That's going to lead you into very black and white thinking. I think the reality is a little subtler. He is not making an honest effort to engage with these questions, just like the rest of them are. I think that's the sort of bad faith that you see all the time.
Yeah, I think a good example of what I'm thinking about is Leah Lippman, who's the host of Strict Scrutiny, wrote a pretty good law review piece about Shelby County v. Holder, where she goes through, there's not a lot of citations in that and not a lot of, precedent in anything that it's relying on. And she goes through and very methodically sort of pulls apart what little support it has. And it's a good, thorough breakdown. And I think the only conclusion you can come away reading that is that not even Roberts, the author of the opinion, could actually believe what he was writing. And that's great. I don't think that's useful for the general public to understand what the Supreme Court is doing, right? They're not going to read a thoroughly researched law review article in the Michigan Law Journal or wherever it was about, these obscure cases about admitting like North Dakota into the Union or whatever it was. They need someone that the general public, if they want to understand what's going on, they need somebody to say, this is bullshit, right? Like what Roberts is doing here is acting on a 40-year plan to gut the Voting Rights Act, that he worked in the Reagan administration and wanted to gut the Voting Rights Act then, that this is something he's always wanted to do. There's no legal support for it, and we don't have to pretend otherwise. Like that's helpful. That's not a shot at Leah, who's a great scholar, but
the host of easily one of the top 3 Supreme Court podcasts.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to.
Only thing I wanted to add is that you see this argument about engaging in good faith in the practice of law also. Like, I hope we teased that out when we were talking about why Jones Day says that they take on the clients that they do, because everybody deserves a lawyer or whatever. That is an argument in bad faith. Nobody goes to Jones Day saying, Mommy, Johnson & Johnson doesn't have a lawyer. You know what I mean? Like, that's not a real fucking thing. So I think it's just something to keep in mind, and then what sort of culture flows from that. That's what I'm saying about the honor too. There are reasons to go work at a big law firm, but don't say that it's honor.
We have one more question, then we'll kick it to John.
Gentleman in the back had his hand up from the beginning. Yeah, or in the middle. Sorry.
So big law engages in obfuscation, obviously. Employment lawyers are union busters. Antitrust lawyers defend monopolies. And I guess my question is there a value in upping or increasing the social cost of engaging in this sort of work?
Yes.
And how do you up the social cost, especially when there's really concerted, concentrated efforts on the other side to obfuscate what they're doing?
Do you mean, like, by social cost, do you mean, like, shaming them? I don't mean it in a pejorative way, like, but you mean, like, exposing?
Well, I guess the reason I think it's a legitimate question is, like, on a personal level, if people are able to rationalize this work by saying everyone deserves an attorney, and you want to push back against that, I mean, you are increasing the social cost in some respects of doing that sort of work. So how do you go about that? And should we be targeting, or not really targeting, but should we be upping the social cost for like law students who are also going to work for these firms?
Wait, can I just really quickly attack that? I wouldn't use the language you used at all, but I do think that it's really important for law firms and the lawyers that join them to be subject to the same public scrutiny that any other powerful actor or powerful institution in our society is. And law firms have, in part because of everyone deserves a lawyer, have done this great job of largely shutting down any of that scrutiny or criticism for a very long time. And I think, I come here as a journalist, and I think it's really important that the media play a role in bringing a lot of this stuff to light and making it clear what these corporate lawyers are doing in their day-to-day jobs and the costs that sometimes inflicts upon other people.
Yeah, I think the law has a culture of like collegiality that it prides itself on, and so you will definitely be sort of rowing against the current. But I do think it's important, to know your values, and if you think somebody's values don't align with yours, you should, react appropriately. I got into an argument with a law professor, a collegial argument, Eric Siegel, about what is, over the line. At what point will you stop, as a courtesy, reading someone's paper and getting in debates with them at events or whatever? And, he was saying John Eastman, who helped organize the insurrection, had crossed that line, but Eugene Volokh, who regularly says slurs to his minority students in class as a point of pride, didn't cross that line.
For intellectual reasons. Right,
of course. And I think that's kind of bullshit. I think it's that's, I think wherever the line has been set in the law, it is way too far out there. And we need to be far more aggressive in general about making people feel like shit if they're going to do shitty things. Seriously, it's that. I do think it's simple. I don't think you should be nice to Noah Feldman. Well, students, you should be fine. But his professors should make him very uncomfortable. The other professors here should be very rude to Noah Feldman.
Yeah. All right, I think we can. We'll kick it to Jon to wrap.
Thank you to 5-4. You all are amazing. Such a joy. What a wonderful weekend, and what a wonderful way to wrap it up, or almost. And thank you to David Enrich. It was just a wonderful book and a wonderful conversation. I want to do one more time for all that they brought to us this afternoon. I really appreciate all of you coming for my closing remarks, and I appreciate 5-4 opening for me. And I just want to welcome all the future and some current servants of the damned to Harvard Law School. I wrote these remarks sitting over in my corner, and I don't know how long they're going to take, but I'm going to get you out of here as close to 3 o'clock as I can. I had some things I wanted to say, especially in mind of the people who've been here for a couple of days, to see if I could pull some of the ideas together. So I'll see what I can do. So with the ideas of the conference in mind and the location of where we are, I'm going to share a stylized history that is more or less based on a true story. It goes like this. Legal education as we know it, and the legal profession as we know it, began here. Literally here, in this building, about 150 years ago. On this spot. And this building is very much a physical manifestation of what, if you look around, is a pretty legible vision of legal education, of the legal profession, and of law. The vision was rapidly realized once this building was in place. Harvard had been around for a while, but this was a moment in which it really took hold, and continues to be the model that dominates how lay people become law people. We got the money for this building around 1880. I'm just doing this from more or less memory, so I could be wrong on some of these things, but around 1880, from someone named Austin, hence the name Austin Hall. And it was during the deanship of Christopher Columbus Langdell, our first dean at Harvard Law School, probably the first dean of any law school in the country, and the longest serving dean at Harvard Law School. He was here from 1870 to 1895. He wasn't an academic when we brought him on. He was a New York lawyer. I didn't really have big law back then, but he was as close as you could get to something like that. The time period in which he served was, if you'll notice, right around the two sides of when this building was financed and built, which was also the time of the Gilded Age, more or less. And there was a problem in the legal profession at the time, which is that lawyers, believe it or not, were not loved. And they weren't taken terribly seriously, and much of what they did wasn't taken very seriously. And the law and the legal profession, in some sense, needed some source of legitimacy. And Harvard understood that they could help provide that. And they made a deal. We will build an institution and promise a different form of legal education to give to the legal profession at this moment in the Gilded Age more legitimacy, to in turn give legitimacy to the laws that were making possible the Gilded Age. So as industrialization and concentration of wealth and corporations were growing and producing inequalities and all kinds of injuries and harm, the legal profession was looking for some way to serve those with power and money, to give them credibility, to justify the laws that would enable them to continue in the process of what we know as, a really profound moment of inequality and injustice. We've had so many, though, it's hard to distinguish. The legal profession at the time really wasn't a profession, and so the question was, how are we going to create that legitimacy? And the answer was, well, put it in a university that's well known, first of all. We're going to make it something. It's not just an apprenticeship anymore. And we're going to bring people here for a few years and make it seem rigorous. Indeed, we've achieved that. It does seem rigorous. And then we're going to make it scientific. We don't know how exactly, but let Christopher Columbus Langdell figure that out. And that's exactly what he figured out. He came up with a method that he made seem scientific, where if you just went about studying law in a particular way, you would discover the truth and essence of that law. You would understand the logic, the categories, how it all worked, how it was one beautiful picture. I'm not sure exactly what the theory is, but we're going to defer to nature sometimes, or God. And we're going to say that it is pretty much as it should be, and we're going to teach it to you. And we're going to come up with a way where we can provide all of that authority, nature, God, science, universities, to law and the people who come through this institution. And we will be able to charge them money and think about the economic situation here. Have you seen this building? Did you look into the classrooms? They're huge. This is the biggest. But look at the other ones. Austin North downstairs holds about 175 students. That was the big classroom that people would go to. Just hallways and classrooms. No place to discuss students about what's going on in their lives. Just put them in the classroom and move them on. In large numbers where we can charge all of them tuition, we put one person like me in the front of the classroom and ask the students questions about the case. Brilliant. Do it for 3 years, charge them, and they're going to go get a job. And sure enough, it worked. And we put our students into positions of power so that into the 20th century, we became known as the West Point of Wall Street. Who provided the money to build this building? The Austin family, railroad tycoons, who'd made their money at this time period, didn't like lawyers either, but thought, what the hell? The people who paid for this building and paid for the way we teach law were the beneficiaries of the vision that would teach law in a particular way that would justify the existing laws at the time that themselves placed property and property rights above almost all else. Where property, if you think about it, is nothing but inherited wealth and power. And then said we're also going to defer disproportionately to contract, as if contract, think Noam Chomsky, is manufactured consent. Contract is nothing but a conduit of power. It reflects the existing starting positions of every party engaged in a contract, and if you start with a lot of wealth and you're contracting with someone with very little wealth, the contract is just going to manifest that. It's brilliant. And we can think of ways in law to help amass and aggregate that property and wealth, the corporation, and make it even more powerful. Those were the ideas that were surviving, that were thriving, that were coming out of this place. You needed a little legal theory, you needed a little legitimacy, you needed a model, you needed a place to send these students to make them pay, and we did it. And look, it's a beautiful room, but the structure of this building says so much. We're in a courtroom, right? The high bench here, an appellate bench. This is the height. This is the room above all the classrooms. This is the room that transcends and sends the message to our students. The courtroom, the appellate court, this is the high point. And we are as close to heaven. Look, they painted it blue. You see the clouds up there. It's gorgeous. This building, paid for by the Austin building, is not unusual. 6 of the 10 buildings on the Harvard Law School campus are not named after former deans. 4 of them former deans. The other 6 named after people who made their money in business. We have an unnamed building that we're waiting for a donor for. I'm willing to make some predictions. The vision is legible. This building is constructed, this campus is constructed, and legal education was constructed with a purpose. What's less visible is that this place has also been a site of resistance. Meaningful resistance. Critical race theory emerges from this space, in part in reaction and relation to what's happening in the general design. Molly Coleman is in the back row. People's Parity Project. Incredible organization and group of students who came together and say, we're pushing back. In this building, there's a spot that you may not appreciate. It's historic. It used to be the janitor's closet. In 1950, Harvard Law School became the last major law school in the U.S. to admit women. In 1950, it began admitting women. Out of a class of 520, it allowed 12 in. And for the next decade or so, that was more or less the ratio. Imagine yourself one of 12 women in a class of 500 in classrooms of this size. Before 1950, one of the explanations that Harvard Law School gave to people when they asked, doesn't everyone deserve to go to law school? The answer was, we don't have women's bathrooms. It's a powerful answer. It captures the way in which our structures allow us to provide explanations and rationalizations. And so to allow women, what they had to do was they had to create a bathroom out of the janitor's closet in the basement, the women's bathroom today. The only bathroom on campus. We had many buildings, so if women were taking an exam over in Langdale North and had to go to the bathroom in their 3-hour exam, they would have to run over here and use this bathroom. That was the least of their problems. What women found when they came here, many of you know about it, I won't go into the detail, but it more or less sucked. Even as they excelled in their classes, they were being gaslighted and treated very differently and began to sometimes feel like there was something wrong with them. They couldn't put a name on it, at least not until they started talking. And where would women talk in a building, in a structure, in a campus like this? The only place where they would have in common, together, alone, what had been the janitor's closet, a bathroom. And in that bathroom, they would chat and start talking about what they found ridiculous and discovered that they were not alone in realizing how much they didn't like the place and how it was treating them. And also, that maybe if they organized, they could start pushing back. And also that the lesson of what they were getting from this is that Harvard Law School was not the meritocracy that it was pretending to be. They felt that in their legal education, and also that what was going on in legal education was going on in the legal profession. And what was going on in the legal profession was also manifesting in law. They were discovering that this was all kind of one sexist, biased story. And they realized their common interests, and they began working together to change Harvard Law School. They made real progress. We're not there, but as of now, more than half the Harvard Law School students are women. That's one measure of success that comes from that kind of organizing. These students would go on to work together, become feminists. Law school, Harvard Law School turned many of them into feminists, and they would go work on feminist causes after that, including RBG, who did so very famously. But my point is less about that story than the story that they came together here within existing legal structures in a bathroom to change those structures. And we do have more women, and we now have more bathrooms. Now, at this moment at least, we are occupying the courtroom. We're here in this high point at Harvard Law School. And we completely know what the problems are. And we can name it corporate capture. There's other names, other ways of describing it, and other elements of it, but corporate capture is one of them. In fact, we know it so well that we can easily be overwhelmed by it, and we don't know what to do about it. And what I would say to end the conference is that what we should do about it is look at what the winners have done in this competition. Look at what the women did at Harvard Law School, coming together and saying, we can change the structures. Look at what corporations have done. Do you know what a corporation is? It's an organization of different people seeing a shared interest and amalgamating, aggregating that interest and directing it towards a common purpose. Corporation, corpus, many, one body. The trick is to come together. Capitalists unionized. They unionized. And they built power. They had a shared vision. They changed the story. They invested, and they invested including in law schools, building buildings, changing legal theories, attracting students, the works. They believed that they could make a difference. And they have made a difference. They've made a pretty bad world much worse. We can make a difference. Let's go do it. Thanks, everybody.